Hi there. I'm so glad you're here because I can't wait to tell you the story of how this track came to life.
August in Bellmere, Ohio had a way of making everything feel tired. The pavement along Main Street shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Storefront windows reflected a hard white glare. The air itself felt used up, like the town had been breathing too long without rest. By the time Marlie Quinn stepped down from the old station wagon with her duffel bag and one dented suitcase, the heat had already soaked through the back of her faded t-shirt and settled between her shoulders like a hand that would not let go. No one said goodbye the right way. Her foster mother kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. Her foster father looked straight ahead, jaw set, like he was waiting for a red light that would never change. They had driven 3 hours to bring her here, to a town Marlie had never seen, because a cousin of a cousin had once mentioned there might be temporary work at a diner. Maybe a room somewhere, maybe something. Maybe. That was the word adults used when they were done promising. "You're almost 18, her foster mother said at last, still not turning around. "You're old enough to start figuring some things out." Marlie stood there with the car door open, one hand on the frame, feeling the truth settle in deeper than the heat. This was not a transition. This was an exit. "I thought I was staying until school started," she said. Her voice came out calm. That surprised even her. Her foster father gave a short shrug. Plans changed. That was all. No apology. No argument. No looking her in the eye. Just plans changed. Like she was a piece of furniture that no longer fit in the room. Then the car pulled away. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just steady and final. Marlie stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase beside her and watched the station wagon disappear past a row of half-empty buildings with peeling paint and sun-faded signs. A hardware store with dusty tools in the window. A pharmacy that looked like it had stopped trying 10 years ago. A diner with a buzzing neon sign that blinked open, then went dim, then buzzed back to life again. Bellmere looked like the kind of town that had once believed in itself very deeply. Now it looked like a town trying not to think too hard about what it had lost. She picked up her suitcase and started walking. There was no real plan in it, just movement. Movement felt better than standing still where someone had left you. The suitcase wheels caught in the cracks of the sidewalk, so she carried it by the handle instead. Her duffel bag thumped against her hip. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck. She passed a barber shop, a church with a crooked white sign, two boys on bicycles cutting across the street, and an older man asleep on a bench under the weak shade of a sycamore tree. No one stopped her. No one asked if she was all right. That, more than anything, made the moment feel American in the saddest possible way. People saw, people knew, but everybody had learned to keep moving. At the far end of Main Street, past the diner and the boarded-up Five and Dime, Marlie finally saw it. The Marigold Theater. It stood a little apart from the rest of the block, as if time had forgotten to finish tearing it down. The brick facade was cracked. The old marquee still hung over the sidewalk, its missing letters leaving broken words behind. One poster case held nothing but yellowed paper and dust. The glass doors were cloudy from age, but even through the grime, she could see the shape of a lobby beyond them. Dark. Still, waiting. Most people would have seen a dead building, a burden, a money pit. One more thing a town like Bellmere could not afford to save. But Marlie stopped cold, because she knew something about abandoned things. She knew how they looked from the outside. Used up, passed over, too expensive to fix, too complicated to keep. She also knew that sometimes the saddest places were the ones that had once been loved the most. She stepped closer. The bricks held the day's heat. A torn strip of old gold paint clung to the ticket booth window. Above the entrance, half the letters were gone, but enough remained to hint at what this place had once been. Not just a building, a gathering place, a memory, a room where people had once sat shoulder to shoulder and laughed at the same jokes, cried at the same scenes, clapped for the same songs. For the first time all day, Marlie felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly. Hope was too big, too risky, too easy to lose. This was smaller than hope, quieter. A pull, a feeling she had learned to trust. The kind that showed up when an old lamp still had one good wire left, or a broken drawer only needed the right pressure at the right angle. She stood there in the August heat, looking at that wounded old theater, and had the strange, steady feeling that she was looking at something the rest of Bellmere had gotten wrong. And though she did not know it yet, the same could have been said about her. Marlie did not go inside the theater that first afternoon. She only stood there for a while, one hand resting on the handle of her suitcase, letting the sight of it settle into her chest. Then the sun dropped lower. The heat did not ease much, but the light changed. Long shadows stretched across Main Street. The diner's neon sign buzzed again. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped shut. Bellmere was folding itself into evening, and Marlie knew she could not spend the night standing on a sidewalk pretending she had a plan. So she circled the building. The side alley was narrow, cluttered with weeds pushing through cracked pavement, rusted soda crates, and a dented trash bin tipped halfway onto its side. The brick wall along the theater was streaked dark in places where years of rain had run down and dried again. Near the back, she found an old service entrance with a warped wooden awning over it. The door was chained. The lock looked old. The concrete step beneath it was still warm from the sun. It was not home, but it was out of sight. That was enough for one night. She dragged her suitcase under the awning, tucked her duffel behind her legs, and sat with her back against the door. Her whole body ached now that she had stopped moving. She was thirsty, hungry, and trying not to think too far ahead. Thinking too far ahead was dangerous when you had nowhere to go. It opened up too much empty space. Across the alley, somebody had hung wind chimes from a back porch. They clinked softly in the thick evening air. Marlie pulled her knees up and watched the light fade. By the time darkness fully settled in, the town had gone mostly quiet. A truck rolled by once. A dog barked 3 streets over. Somewhere nearby, an old air conditioning unit kicked on with a tired groan and kept rattling like it might die before morning. Marlie slept in pieces, not deeply, never fully. The concrete was hard under her hip, and every small sound pulled her halfway awake. But sometime before dawn, the air cooled just enough for her to stop feeling the day's heat pressing against her skin. She drifted off with her cheek against her arm and woke to the sound of metal banging somewhere nearby. She jerked upright. For a second, she did not know where she was. Then the alley came back into focus. The door, the suitcase, the theater. A man was standing 10 feet away near the trash bin, tossing flattened cardboard into the back of a pickup truck. He was lean and gray-haired and wearing a sweat-darkened work shirt with the sleeves cut off. He looked over at her once, not startled exactly, just measuring. "You planning to live back there?" he asked. His voice was dry, not cruel, not kind. Marlie pushed loose hair out of her face and stood up too fast. "No, sir." He glanced at the suitcase, then at the door behind her, then back to her. "Usually when somebody spends the night in an alley," he said, "it's because they ran out of better ideas." She almost smiled at that, but not quite. "That's about right." He gave a small grunt, like honesty was at least worth something. Then he reached into the truck, pulled out a plastic bottle of water, and set it on the ground between them. "Store opens at 8, he said. "Hardware place up front. Don't block the alley." That was all. He got in the truck and drove off. Marlie picked up the bottle and drank half of it in one breath. An hour later, with the town properly awake, she crossed back around to Main Street. The diner was open now. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the screen door, rich enough to make her stomach tighten. She stood outside for a moment, trying to decide whether pride was worth more than breakfast, when a woman from inside spotted her through the glass. She came out wiping her hands on a towel. She was in her 30s, maybe. Dark hair tied up, sharp eyes, strong shoulders. The kind of woman who looked like she had been carrying too much for too long and had learned how to do it without complaint. "You looking for someone?" she asked. Marlie shook her head. The woman looked at the suitcase, then at Marlie's face. "No," she said gently, answering her own question. "You're looking for a way not to fall apart in public." That landed so close to the truth, Marlie did not know what to say. The woman hooked a thumb toward the diner door. "Come on, I've got scrambled eggs that missed the breakfast plate by about 30 seconds. Name's Rosa." Inside, the diner was cool, or at least cooler than the street. A ceiling fan turned overhead. Coffee mugs clinked. Somebody near the window was talking about the heat, about the power grid, about how if the air conditioning at the senior center quit again, folks were going to be in trouble. Rosa slid a plate in front of Marlie without ceremony. Marlie looked down at the food, then back up. "I don't have money," Rosa shrugged. "Good thing I didn't ask for any." Marlie ate slowly at first, then faster. And all through that first real meal, with the hum of the diner around her and Main Street waking up outside, her mind kept circling back to the theater at the end of the block. Dark, still, waiting, like it knew she would come back. After breakfast, Marlie told herself she was only going back to the theater to take one more look. Just one. That was the kind of lie a person told when she already knew the truth. The morning heat was climbing fast by the time she crossed Main Street again. Bellmere moved slowly in it. A few pickups rolled by. The barber swept yesterday's hair off the sidewalk. Someone down the block was wrestling with a window unit that sounded like it had been mad at the world since 1987. At the end of the street, the Marigold Theater stood in the same stubborn silence as before. Worn, faded, still holding itself up. Marlie walked the perimeter more carefully this time. Around back, past the warped awning and the service door where she had spent the night, she found a narrow loading area half hidden by waist-high weeds and a stack of broken pallets. One of the rear windows had been covered years ago with plywood, but the lower edge had rotted through. Not enough to invite the whole world in. Just enough for someone patient. She set down her duffel, tested the board, then eased it back. Inside, the air smelled like dust, mildew, old velvet, and time. She stood still until her eyes adjusted. At first, all she could make out was shape and shadow. Then the place began to reveal itself piece by piece. A backstage corridor, a rack of bent hangers, a cracked mirror rimmed with dead bulbs, torn costumes sealed under a gray skin of dust. Beyond that, through a gap in the curtain, the dark sweep of the stage and rows of seats waiting in the hush. The whole place felt abandoned, but not empty. Empty was different. Empty meant nothing left. This place still had something in it. A pulse, maybe. A memory. Marlie moved slowly, careful where she put her feet. She had spent enough time around old houses and neglected basements to know that forgotten places could be fragile in mean ways. Floors gave, nails rose, wiring bit. Still, there was order beneath the decay. That was what caught her eye. The bones of the building were good. The stage floor had wear but not collapse. The walls were thick plaster over old masonry. The ceilings were high enough to let heat rise. And when she found the side doors leading into the lobby and tested one of the rusted push bars, she felt the faintest drift of air move through the building. Not much, but enough. She followed it. At the far end of the upper hallway, she found a vent box built high into the wall, then another above the back stairs. Old passive ventilation. Not modern air conditioning, not magic. Just smart design from a time when buildings had to know how to breathe on their own. She looked up towards the ceiling and felt something inside her sharpen. That was when she heard the voice behind her. "You break in often? Or am I getting special treatment?" Marlie spun so fast her shoulder hit the wall. The gray-haired man from the alley stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his expression flat as a shovel blade. He had a ring of keys in one hand and a paper sack in the other. "I wasn't stealing," Marlie said. "Didn't say you were." He stepped inside, glanced around, then looked back at the shifted plywood over the rear window. "But, for the record," he added, "that was not exactly subtle." Marlie straightened. "I just wanted to see it." He gave a low grunt. "Most folks around here only want to see it flattened." He walked past her into the dim hallway like he belonged there. Maybe once he had. He set the paper sack on an old ticket counter and brushed dust from the wood with the side of his hand. His movements were careful, almost irritated by their own tenderness. "You the man from the hardware store?" Marlie asked. "Eddie Boone." He did not offer a handshake, just a name. Then he nodded towards the ceiling vent she had been studying. "Notice that, did you?" Marlie hesitated. "It still pulls air." A quick flicker crossed his face, not quite surprise. Closer to respect fighting its way through habit. "Used to be this place could stay 10 degrees cooler than the sidewalk if you knew when to open what and when to close it," he said. "Built before everybody started thinking comfort came out of a wall socket." Marlie looked out toward the dark auditorium again. 10 degrees cooler. In this heat, that was not a detail. That was a chance. Eddie opened the paper sack and pulled out a biscuit wrapped in wax paper. He held it out without ceremony. "Rosa told me you were snooping around." Marlie took it. "She told on me?" "She worried on you," he said. "Different thing." He moved toward the stage and stood there, staring into the rows of dust-covered seats. For the first time, his voice lost some of its grit. "I ran lights here when I was 19, he said. "Then sets, then motors, then whatever broke." He gave a dry laugh. "Toward the end, that was mostly everything." Marlie looked at the faded curtains, the dead bulbs, the heat-softened silence. "Why'd it close?" "Same reason most things close." He shrugged. "Money left, people left, then hope left." That sat between them for a moment. Heavy, true. Outside, somewhere on Main Street, a siren gave one short warning burst and cut off. A minute later, the lights from the lobby sign across the street blinked twice, then went dark. Eddie turned towards the front windows. "Power's buckling again," he muttered. By noon, the whole block was talking about rolling outages. At Rosa's diner, people were already complaining that the old folks at the senior center would not last if the air conditioning quit for good. Someone mentioned the town council meeting that night. Someone else said Cal Bennett was making another offer on the theater lot, and this time the bank might finally take it. Marlie said very little. But all afternoon, one thought stayed with her. Not about the broken seats, not about the dust, not even about where she would sleep that night. It was the way that building breathed. And the quiet, stubborn idea that maybe Bellmere was about to lose the one place in town that still knew how to survive the heat. By late afternoon, the heat over Bellmere had turned mean. Not loud, not dramatic, just relentless. It sat on the town like a heavy hand and refused to lift. The sidewalks gave off a baked, bitter smell. Window units rattled in apartment windows all over Main Street. The traffic light at the corner blinked once, steadied, then blinked again, as if even it was tired. People moved slower now, quieter. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when everybody is waiting for something bad to happen and hoping not to be the one it happens to first. Marlie spent the day inside the Marigold. At first, Eddie had only meant to show her a few things. How the old vent doors above the stage could still be opened by hand. How the side hall transoms let air travel if the front lobby doors were cracked at the right angle. How the thick walls in shaded back rooms held on to cool longer than anything built after 1970. But once they started, they kept going. They hauled open windows that had not moved in years. They swept broken glass from the lobby floor. They rolled up rotting carpet near the back hallway where trapped heat had nowhere to go. Marlie worked without much talking. That was one of the things Eddie had started noticing about her. She did not make a speech every time she had an idea. She just looked, thought, then moved. Around noon, Rosa came by carrying a cardboard tray of sweet tea and a sack full of ham sandwiches wrapped in paper. She stopped dead in the lobby when she saw the dust, the open vents, the shafts of moving air. "Well," she said, looking from Eddie to Marlie, "either y'all are fixing to raise the dead in here, or you've got a plan." Eddie wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. No plan. Marlie glanced up toward the vent above the stairs. "Not a full one yet," she said. Rosa studied her for a moment. Then she set the drinks down on the old ticket counter. "That sounds like the start of one." By 3 o'clock, word had started traveling the way it always did in small towns. Not fast in a straight line, fast in loops. A kid named June Harper showed up first. 12 years old, all knees and ponytail and curiosity, with a melted popsicle stain on the front of her shirt. She stood in the theater doorway with her hands on her hips, like she had every right in the world to be there. "My grandma says this place is haunted," she announced. Eddie snorted. "Your grandma says that about the post office too." June ignored him and looked at Marlie. "Are you really fixing it?" Marlie shook her head a little. "Not fixing all of it." "Then what?" Marlie looked out toward the rows of seats, the darkened aisles, the high ceiling that still held the cooler air above the floor. She thought about the diner conversation, the senior center, the outages, the way the power had blinked twice before lunch. She chose her words carefully. "I think this place can help people ride out the heat," she said, "at least for a while." June's face brightened instantly, the way a match takes flame. "I knew it," she whispered, like she had been waiting for someone to say exactly that. By early evening, Bellmere's town council meeting had started down the block. Cal Bennett was there, pressing again for the sale of the Marigold lot. He called it dead space, underused property, a smart business decision. Sheriff Tom Avery stood near the back wall with his arms crossed, listening with that guarded look men wear when they have learned not to show concern until concern becomes paperwork. Rosa slipped into the room 10 minutes late, still smelling faintly of grease and iced tea. She listened just long enough to hear Cal say, "That building has been useless for years." That was when she stood up. "No," Rosa said, clear enough that half the room turned before she finished the sentence. "It's been ignored for years. That's not the same thing." Cal gave her a polite smile that was mostly teeth. "With respect, Rosa, nobody's putting money into a collapsing theater because a few folks feel sentimental about it." "It's not sentiment," she said. "It's the only building on Main that still knows how to stay cool when the grid starts choking." That changed the room. Not completely, but enough. Tom Avery straightened a little. Cal frowned. And in the silence that followed, the lights overhead flickered once, then twice. Then the whole room dropped into darkness. Somebody cursed softly. A woman near the front gasped. Through the open windows came the sound of air conditioners dying up and down the block, like a line of engines giving out one after another. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then people started talking all at once. Questions, heat, the senior center, medical equipment, kids at home. The kind of fear that rises fastest when the air is already too hot to breathe right. Sheriff Avery took control the way men like him do when there is no more time left for hesitation. "Everybody stay calm," he said, though his own voice carried strain now. "We'll get backup power checked. We'll get the senior center assessed." Rosa stepped closer. "There may not be time," she said. "Not if this outage runs long." Tom looked at her, then at the dark windows, then back again. "Say what you're thinking." Rosa did not waste a word. Marlie and Eddie opened the Marigold up today. Vents, cross-flow, back rooms, the whole thing. "It's cooler in there already." Tom's expression tightened. "The theater?" "Yes." "The condemned theater?" "Go feel it for yourself," Rosa said. That was the moment the story shifted. Not fully, not yet, but the first crack had opened in the town's certainty. Outside, the heat still pressed down on Bellmere. Inside the dark council room, people stood sweating in their church clothes and work shirts, suddenly forced to consider that the old theater at the end of Main Street might not be a ruin after all. It might be the one place still breathing when the rest of the town began to fail. And at the Marigold, with the last good daylight slanting across the lobby floor, Marlie stood in the quiet and waited. Not for rescue, not for permission. For the moment, the town finally understood what she had seen the first time she looked through those dusty doors. Sheriff Tom Avery did go feel it for himself. And once he stepped inside the Marigold, he understood. The theater was not cold. It was something better than cold. It was bearable, gentle, shaded. The kind of relief that let a person's lungs slow down and their panic loosen its grip. The air moved through the old building in a steady, natural current. The high vents pulled heat upward. The thick walls held back the worst of the evening's sun. The back rooms stayed cooler still, quiet and dim, like the building had remembered exactly what it had been made to do. Within half an hour, Bellmere started arriving. Rosa brought over pitchers of ice water, paper cups, and 2 trays of food that had to be served before it spoiled. Eddie opened every room that was safe to use and set folding chairs where the lobby was widest. June Harper ran messages up and down Main Street like she had been waiting all summer for a mission worthy of her speed. Sheriff Avery used his patrol car to bring over 2 elderly residents from the senior center, then went back for more. By sunset, the old theater was full, not with applause, not with music, not with bright marquee lights and Saturday crowds, but with something just as sacred. Need. Children lay across rows of faded seats with damp washcloths on their necks. Old men sat fanning themselves with church bulletins. A young mother rocked a sleepy toddler near the aisle. Someone found an old battery lantern backstage. Someone else started handing out crackers. And through it all, Marlie kept moving. Quietly, steadily. She checked the side doors, adjusted the airflow, carried water, made space. She did not look like a girl who had been dropped off and forgotten 3 days earlier. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. At one point, an elderly woman with trembling hands reached out and caught Marlie lightly by the wrist. "I had my first date here," she said, looking around the dim lobby with wet eyes. "He bought me lemon candy and held my hand through the whole picture." She smiled to herself, small and far away. "I never thought this place would take care of me again." Marlie swallowed hard and squeezed her hand. Across the room, Cal Bennett appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The crowded seats, the water coolers, the sheriff carrying in another box fan that did not even matter much compared to the building itself. The old theater he had called Dead Space was the one place on Main Street keeping the town together. When he finally stepped inside, he did not speak right away. Some truths do not arrive loudly. They arrive with embarrassment, with humility, with the slow realization that value and profit are not always the same thing. Near midnight, the power finally came back. One by one, lights blinked alive across Bellmere. A murmur moved through the theater, soft, tired, relieved, but almost no one rushed to leave. For a little while longer, people stayed where they were, talking quietly, breathing easier, looking around as if they had all just discovered something about their town they should have known years ago. In the days that followed, the story of that night traveled farther than the heat wave ever had. The town council postponed the sale, then canceled it. Rosa organized a fundraiser. Eddie donated his time. Sheriff Avery handled the paperwork no one else wanted to touch. Even Cal Bennett, after a long silence and a longer look at his own conscience, offered building materials instead of demolition plans. And Marlie? Marlie stopped sleeping behind locked doors and started sleeping in the small upstairs office Eddie helped clean out for her. It was not fancy. Just a narrow bed, a working lamp, and a window that looked over Main Street. But it was hers. More than that, it was chosen for her. That mattered. By October, the Marigold had not been fully restored, but it was alive again. The lobby hosted community dinners. The stage held children's music recitals and winter coat drives. June Harper sang under the repaired lights one Friday night, nervous and glowing, while half the town clapped like she was playing Carnegie Hall. And in the back of the room, Marlie stood beside Eddie and Rosa, listening to the applause echo against the old plaster walls. For the first time in a very long while, she did not feel like the extra person in somebody else's life. She felt woven in, needed, kept. Maybe that is what home really is. Not the place where you are supposed to end up, but the place that finally makes room for you when the rest of the world does not. And maybe the same is true for people. Sometimes the ones this world overlooks are the very ones holding the quiet wisdom, the steady hands, and the stubborn heart needed to carry others through. So let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a person or a place and almost missed its worth because it did not shine right away? And have you ever been the one waiting for someone to see what was still good inside you? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about hope, resilience, and the forgotten strength hiding in ordinary lives.